let's start with an introduction.
Sure.
Would you like to introduce yourself and
Oh,
your
right,
relationship
yeah.
and the history of the post-punk genre?
Hi, I'm Steve. As you know, I work in the dirt shop. Just before, I was basically worked in support work, stroke mental health, and before that, I had I run an agency for mainly old punk bands like UK Subs, 999, Vibrators, sort of stuff that I grew up with and loved.
Yeah.
And it's sort of come, and I'm now in the shop, and I'm sort of semi-retired now, but it's very comfortable working in that shop. Yeah.
So who are your sort of favourite punk bands? When I say punk bands or post-punk bands, who comes to mind immediately?
Post-punk. Well, we've been listening to the Gang of Four today. I totally love. I've rediscovered them. It's quite hard to say the term post-punk.
Yeah.
Some people say it's CC and the Banshees, but then you could argue they were one of the first punk bands. They formed in '76. Sid Vicious played drums, and they just got up there and done it, which is kind of a punk ethic, if you like. Just got up there and played.
I think the ones that come to mind for me are your Joy Division and Wire.
Oh well, Wire also very very early. They were around in '76, so I think there was bands at that time that would become more defined as post-punk, but they were there in the start, you know.
So obviously one of the most important areas that I'm looking at for my dissertation is the 1979 Rock Against Racism.
Right. The one I went to was in Brockwell Park. That was I think it was Aswad, Little Fingers, and Elvis Costello. Yeah. And I remember being in Cambridge and going up on the bus to that, and we marched through. I think we met up in Hyde Park. And then we marched all the way to Brixton, and that was one of the earliest Little Fingers shows I went to. Yeah. And funnily enough, Ali McMorley from Little Fingers lives in Norwich, and he often walks up and down here. So.
That's amazing. So what do you think the spark for like a movement like Rock Against Racism was? Well, politically and socially.
Well, basically,
at the time.
Basically, from what I remember, is there was a lot of there was sort of mass unemployment around 76, 77. It was bad, and you also had a lot of rubbish on the road, and that at that time the National Front built up, and it was run by a really fat, horrible bastard called Martin Webster. And from what I can remember, and you may have to research this, which I'm sure you will. There was a reaction to this, but the National Front was really quite extreme. But as you'll find into the 80s, you have splinter groups like Combat 18 and things like that. But from what I remember is they were calling from the stage. They were calling people to go to Brick Lane and actually physically fight. The fascists at that time, and from which if you go back and study this, the Mosley's black shirts, and they were basically fought a battle in the East End, and they got battered, and that was the end of them.
From what I've read, from my research against racism concepts, it's widely known that they were kind of the reason they sought to destroy the National Front, and they were responsible for the deterioration of the National Front.
But whenever you get, as you'll probably know, and it sort of worries me at the moment, is whenever you get like low employment, it's when the right wing seize on that and start blaming it on immigration. And it's just completely unfair and unreasonable, and nasty, and people have people got to look after each other and tolerate each other.
Obviously, the political climate has really changed since the 1970s, but in some ways, there's a continuation of the same racial issues and the same social issues.
There always will be, I think. But it's I mean. What can I say, I kind of grew up in Kings Lynn, and I'm really quite astonished how even people I know, a lot of people I know, think you know, they're quite racist, and it's like they're almost scared of different people come, you know, say Kings Lynn. There's not an awful, it's mainly white.
Yeah.
But now that they've had an influx of Polish people, and that seems to be going all right, but you've still got all these kind of village idiot kind of crap, like, oh, there's too many foreigners, foreigners are taking English jobs and all that. But the whole thing about the 50 was they all came over from Jamaica and places like that to do all the jobs that English people did, and they worked on the buses and they worked on the underground at night and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So,
in some ways we've kind of seen the National Front shapeshift into different organisations.
Yeah,
You had the BNP, you've had UKIP, and I guess most recently you've had Reform UK.
but they're coming across as a credible political party.
Yeah.
But when their meetings have been stopped, which I'm pleased about. You know. Yeah.
So I suppose in this age it's kind of important to think what would stop something like Rock Against Racism happening again. What do you think has changed so that we, you know, that we
Well, it
can
could
have
happen
something
again, and
similar?
I hope it does.
Yeah.
I hope it does.
And I guess is being the opposition, or I guess being against all this, you know, outside of racist politics, is the opposition still possible beyond protest songs and you know,
It can be.
political music?
I think it can be done in numbers.
Yeah.
When I first came to Norwich, and I think it was 2011, I think maybe towards the end of the year, the EDL had a march.
Yeah.
But they were completely outnumbered, and people amassed, and they had police protection.
Yeah.
But they were throwing like cans of full beer. One of them missed me and hit some woman with her child.
Yeah.
But the police did nothing.
Yeah.
They just like this, you know, and stuff was going overhead, and there was a few fights and stuff, but that was it.
Yeah.
But that, you know.
So my work is obviously quite centred on London, but I'm wondering if you could tell me, what is the punk scene like in Norwich specifically? Or the political music scene in Norwich?
Well, obviously, I kind of, the people I know, obviously people that come in the shop, all the local bands. I mean, I think it's reasonably left-wing,
So I guess the next thing that I kind of want to come to next is that I think post-punk was considered like quite a good time for like women in rock music.
Yeah,
So-
we had the Au Pairs and people like that, and obviously you know about the Slits, and they did a lot of rock against racism things
So I
as
think
well.
along those same lines, do you think any of the traction that women gained in this period has been lost nowadays? When you look at post-punk or political music now, do you think anything that was gained in the 70s and 80s has been lost
I think
now?
it's still there, but I think the way say female pop artists and they're not the whole way pop music is it's gone backwards in that respect. How women in the music thing is not marketed as being threatening. And I think the nearest thing you got possibly was the Spice Girls.
Yeah.
How ridiculous is that? You know.
I don't know if you're aware of bands like Ammon and the Sniffers, for example.
Well, of course, absolutely, cool. Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. I think they're sort of bringing back some energy from the 70s and 80s.
Oh yeah, but they've got a very Australian sound. Basically, Australian bands are very guitar-driven, quite raw, and you also had the Saints originally, and you had Radio Birdman. But yeah, it's just raw, and there's no posing. Australian bands don't pose.
So like much is obviously said about, you know, punk and post-punk repeating or different little revivals. So you had it in the early 2000s with the Strokes, the Libertines, and all those bands. Do you think any of these bands are going beyond just emulating the same sound, the same style, or do you think they're continuing to add something new to it? Because I think there's an argument that.
I think influences overlap, and you have that kind of American pop punk thing, and I really quite like Paramore. A lot of my friends, they'll stick their noses up, but I think they've got some great tunes. And a band that I went to see last year they're called As December Falls, and they're fantastic.
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah, they're such a great band. I almost felt, well, I know I'm old enough to be their dad, so I felt a little bit old at the gig, and then a few other people, one or two people my age, are into it, but they're very much a young person's thing, so it carries on, you know.
I'm trying to think of bands that are sort of flying the flag for political music in this country now in the last few years. I suppose the one that comes to mind immediately is Sleaford Mods, your Kneecap, your...
Sleaford Mods, I've seen them, yeah.
You know, I think Sleaford Mods often get put in a box of, you know, being quite stereotyped or being quite saturated, I suppose.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'd have to go and see them again, but you know, they were quite inspiring. Yeah. And you actually had Steve Ignorant, who from Crass, he came. Yeah. I think they were influenced by Crass, and I think he came along to the show as well. So, and that's what I was saying earlier to you. There is a cross between you and old, you know.
Yeah, I don't know if you know Idols as well, obviously.
Oh, I've seen them. I've seen them at Blackpool. Yes.
Yeah, I don't know how you felt. I don't know if you saw last year. I think it was Glastonbury, but they held up the life. They had like a life raft in the crowd. With
yes. Well, yeah. You need to do that.
I don't know how you felt about that, because I think that's, for me, it's going beyond just emulating punk. It's doing something proactive. It's doing something quite, you know, with
well, they're letting people know.
Yeah.
Making you know, and letting people know. You know, reminding them this is what's going on. You know.
Yeah. So I think you know, it's quite easy to write these bands off as just preaching to the converted, because I think that's also the thing. Obviously, you know, punk and post-punk, that's inherently quite like a left-wing thing. So I think there's an argument that when you make these political songs through Idols or Sleeping Mods, you're preaching to the converted.
What can you can only say a message, and people understand it and click on. I don't know what more you can do, really. You know.
I suppose also as well. What do you think the biggest difference between punk and post-punk was? What do you think was the jump between the two genres?
I don't think there's any difference. The only thing is some bands are more experimental, and you have a sound, and you go one way or the other, and it's to what great degree, and you have kind of hardcore, American hardcore, but you see, you can have, to me, I mean, if you ever get the chance, go to the Rebellion Festival, and you'll get you know, bands like you know, Discharge or really hardcore bands, and then come to that point, and you'll get some really poppy bands, and you can say, well, they don't sound punk, but they've got the message, and they've got their canvas, so they got their blank canvas, and they paint on it, and that's yeah.
I don't know if you're aware of Simon Reynolds, who's like a musical theorist, but he...
Oh, I think I might have a book. I might have a book of his at home.
Speaking on the difference between punk and post-punk, he said one of the possible ways is to use class as one of the differences between punk and post-punk. So I suppose he was arguing that punk is more working class, but when you have these post-punk singers, they were more middle class, more art school.
Well, you've always had, even from the first punk thing, there was art school people in there, and you have art school bands, and then you have bands like Sham 69 and Cock Sparrow. Yeah. So it you know, it's all good. The whole thing's good. It's people making, you know, rock and roll music, but with something to say. You know.
Yeah. Going back to you know, speaking about rock against racism as well. Do you think there's anything about Gen Z nowadays? Anything about, you know, the young generation nowadays and the young people in this country? Do you think that's a reason why we couldn't have anything like rock against racism? I think there's an argument.
I know what you're saying. Now, basically, I call it electric Valium. Yeah, it's, you know, even though sometimes I can't get off the internet. There's so much there, and you see something, and then you go on. Onto something else, like current affairs and things. But certainly in the 70s, the TV went off at 10, and you had to kind of make your own entertainment. You didn't have phones to look at, so you had to create for yourselves.
So it's almost like with like the influx of all the technology.
Yeah, but there's cultural changes because there's too much TV, there's too many mobile phones, there's too, you know, there's too much of everything, and that can suck the energy out of a lot of young people.
Yeah,
you
so
know.
I suppose there's a direct link between the technology and people being passive.
Yes, and I do think a lot of the TV, I don't watch an awful lot of TV now, and things like the One Show really annoy me. That it's all plastic and plastic smiles, and whereas I think, and like the BBC, they don't even put any sort of protests on the TV anymore, and they used to.
Do you see any bands nowadays making a political kind of music that gives you any sort of optimism?
Probably the ones that you've mentioned.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
really.
But I think there's definitely a need to be proactive, and I think like we said about Idols at Glastonbury, the live
Yeah.
in front of like millions of people. I think that's a really good gesture.